Picture this. You're young William Wordsworth out on Lake Windermere in a stolen boat, middle of the night. Dead quiet, and he's feeling that self-sufficing power of solitude, something he'll write about later, but then the mountains that kind of start to loom over him, right?
Yeah,
and their shadows are all shifting and changing. It's pretty terrifying for him. The whole experience speaks to, I think, his early fascination with just how powerful nature is, but it also hints at maybe something a little deeper, maybe even a sensitivity to the sublime, which, as we'll talk about today, becomes super central to his poetry and relevant to, well, this whole idea of the mad genius we're going to be exploring.
It really is amazing how this event, it seems small, but it's recounted in his autobiographical poem, The Prelude, and kind of foreshadows so much of what we're going to unpack today.
Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, where, well, we're diving into the lives of these brilliant minds, trying to figure out, is there a connection between creativity and mental illness?
And today, we're taking a look at the world of William Wordsworth, using The Prelude and Juliet Barker's Biography to help guide us.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to see if Wordsworth's life, if we can find anything in it that kind of backs up this whole mad genius idea, or maybe challenges it, I guess. It's a tough one. Sensitive for sure, so got to approach it respectfully and, of course, think critically.
For sure. And I think a good place to start might be, Wordsworth's just intense connection to nature. It wasn't some poetic device for him. It was like completely intertwined with who he was, even from childhood. Growing up in the Lake District, he was always out there roaming around, exploring, just soaking it all in.
It sounds like those early experiences, they really left a mark on him, positively and, well, we heard in that first story, maybe unsettling too. Barker even talks about in her book how spooked Wordsworth was by the mountains during that whole boat thing at night.
That incident makes me think of something we see a lot when we explore this mad genius idea, heightened sensitivity. It's a double-edged sword, On one hand, it can really fuel that artistic inspiration, give people a really intense way of seeing beauty and emotion and, well, the whole world around them. But then, on the flip side, it can also make you anxious. You're more vulnerable, even, overwhelmed by things that other people might not find so disturbing.
So was young Wordsworth just like a sensitive guy, or was there something more going on? He was smart though, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely brilliant. Barker makes it clear that he was like super successful in school, at least at first. He got into Cambridge, even got a first-class degree.
But then things get interesting, right? Didn't really follow that, I guess, typical path to success, did he?
Not at all. And that's a pattern we see pretty often with, creative types. There's this push and pull between like conforming and needing that intellectual freedom. Wordsworth, he got disillusioned with how rigid Cambridge was, so he just decides to study on his own, throws himself into poets like Milton. I mean, this is him veering off the path. It's something we've seen with other creative folks too, rejecting what's expected and forging their own way.
Almost like he was making a statement by not excelling in that, traditional way.
Barker doesn't explicitly say that, but she does emphasize that he, chose not to go for that conventional academic success. It's like his mind was already searching for something different, less structured, putting personal exploration above, needing to be validated, this whole resisting the usual measures of achievement. That's classic mad genius, following his own compass.
Totally marching to the beat of his own drum. Then it gets even crazier, right? He goes to France during the French Revolution. Total chaos.
It's super important to think about what was going on then. You have Wordsworth, already sensitive, right? Thrown into this crazy period. I mean, the French Revolution was all about hope, but also insane violence.
Like throwing gasoline on a fire, you've got this heightened sensitivity, and then, bam, a revolution.
Exactly. And Barker points out that Wordsworth, he's all in on the revolution. He even has a kid with this French woman, Annette Vallon. He does get disillusioned with the reign of terror later on, but, this time period, it definitely shaped his creative voice. And it makes you wonder, right, if this level of upheaval, if it makes those sensitivities worse, or even triggers, like real emotional distress. We've seen this with other creative people we've looked at, how huge historical events can be this melting pot for artistic expression, but also psychological turmoil.
So we've got this nature connection, a rebellious streak, and now the French Revolution thrown in. What's all this doing to him personally?
Well, things get complicated. Wordsworth's personal life was, let's just say, messy. He leaves Annette and their daughter in France. That must weigh on him. And then there's his sister, Dorothy. She becomes his rock, his confidant, his creative partner. Barker really paints Dorothy as this vital source of support and inspiration for William.
Sounds like Dorothy being there gave him stability, a grounding force amidst all the crazy stuff and emotional intensity. But I'm curious, are there downsides to a relationship that close? Maybe codependent even? Could that have added to any struggles he might have been having?
That's a good point, and worth thinking about. Yeah, Dorothy was a good force in his life. But yeah, those super close relationships can have their downsides too. It's easy for the lines to blur between support and dependence. And then, to make matters worse, Wordsworth suffers another blow. His brother John dies at sea. Devastating.
So now he's dealing with a lot. This complicated relationship with his sister, the guilt over leaving his lover and child, and now the grief of losing his brother. How does he even cope with all of this? Where does he find peace?
Nature, that's his sanctuary. This is where his connection to the natural world goes beyond just pretty words in a poem. He finds this restorative healing power in nature. It's not about nice scenery. He's wrestling with huge philosophical questions, searching for meaning and purpose.
He's not just admiring nature, he's figuring out how to deal with all these emotions and experiences, like some early version of ecotherapy, way before anyone even knew what that was.
Exactly. Wordsworth just seemed to get this connection between, being human and the natural world. Found comfort in ways most people wouldn't. That's what we see with creative people, right? They find strength in unexpected places.
So far, we've got sensitivity, this rebellion against what society expects, intense emotional stuff, and then this deep connection to nature as his healing source. It's a lot. But does it point to this mad genius thing, or is there more to the story?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's never a simple answer, always more to discover. And when we get to Wordsworth's later years, this whole mad genius thing, it gets even more interesting. Things start changing for him, in his life, his career, everything.
He starts to get recognized for his work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Becomes poet laureate eventually, pretty prestigious position.
Exactly. And it makes you think, right, how does all that recognition affect creative people? For some, it could be stabilizing, validating, like they finally made it.
But couldn't it also be like a lot of pressure? People watching your every move, maybe even fear that you'll lose that creative spark that made you.
Yeah.
We've seen that kind of pressure mess with other artists, right?
Absolutely. And Barker doesn't really go into a ton of detail about that part of Wordsworth's experience, but it's definitely something to consider. Did fame make those sensitivities worse, or did it ground him? Tough to say. What we do know is that family and nature, they stay important to him this whole time.
Dorothy's still there for him. And then he marries Mary Hutchinson, who I think brings something totally different to his life.
Right. Barker points out that Mary, she loved nature too, but she wasn't driven by that same, intense need for new experiences like William and Dorothy. She was more content, grounded.
Sounds like she balanced out those, more turbulent parts of his personality.
Exactly. And that's important when we're trying to figure out this mad genius thing. Wordsworth, he wasn't isolated, totally dependent on Dorothy. He had these close relationships, each one giving him different kinds of connection and grounding. Maybe they actually helped him, protected him from the negative effects of his sensitivities. It's possible.
It goes back to what you were saying before about how this mad genius idea, it often relies on this image of the lonely, tortured artist. But Wordsworth, he doesn't really fit that, does he? He was connected to people, found comfort in nature, and became pretty successful, all things considered.
It does make things more complicated, right? And that's why we got to be careful with this topic. If we only look at Wordsworth through this mad genius lens, we're missing a lot. The complexity of his genius, his humanity, the whole picture.
We've seen that he was a sensitive guy, prone to those intense emotional experiences, probably dealing with some inner turmoil. But he was also super productive, created these amazing works of art, and like you said, had people in his corner.
That's the thing about this whole mad genius thesis, right? It's easy to say creativity equals mental illness, but human experience, especially for these creative minds, it's never that black and white. Wordsworth's life shows that.
I guess we can recognize his struggles and how sensitive he was without saying that's what made him a genius. It's about seeing the whole person, right?
Yeah.
And how their experiences shape them.
Yeah, exactly. Moving past those simple labels and appreciating the nuances, Wordsworth's story reminds us that you can be super sensitive, even go through emotional turmoil, and still be a creative genius, have loving relationships, and find healing in nature.
It seems like his connection to nature, it was always there, always inspiring him, grounding him.
Totally. Barker talks about how even later in life, Wordsworth would spend hours walking around the countryside, watching the seasons change, just finding that peace in the rhythms of nature, that connection. It was part of him, as an artist, as a person.
It's almost like nature gave him this language to express the things you can't really put into words, helped him process those intense emotions and experiences that could have, I don't know, crushed him otherwise.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It makes you think about the power of art, right? Turning struggles into something beautiful, something that means something, something universal even. Wordsworth's poetry, it lets us connect with those deepest emotions, his fears, his joy, his wonder. And by doing that, he shows us, well, a little bit of our own humanity too.
So where do we go from here? We've seen his life, his sensitivity, his struggles, his wins. But this mad genius question, it's still hanging around.
It is, and I think that's good. It means we're really thinking about this stuff, not just settling for easy answers.
So we've explored his life, his sensitivity, the struggles, the triumphs, all that. But this whole mad genius question is still kind of hanging over us. Was there, actual evidence of a mental illness? Something more concrete?
That's the tough part, right? Diagnosing someone from the past, especially someone like Wordsworth. It's tricky, but Barker's biography does give us some interesting hints about his mental state.
Like what? What stood out to you the most?
Well, you can't deny how intense his emotional responses were. We see it throughout his life, from being anxious about those mountains as a kid to, grieving for those he lost. It definitely suggests he was just, I don't know, more sensitive to emotions, maybe even experienced them more intensely than most people.
So more than just like a typical artist being dramatic. We've talked about sensitivity, but this sounds, I don't know, deeper.
Yeah, it's more than just being sensitive. Barker even mentions how people thought his reactions were over the top, sometimes even debilitating. For example, when his brother John died, his grief was so bad it actually affected his health. Insomnia, digestive problems, even what we might call panic attacks today.
That's rough. But were those just temporary things because of stressful events, or could it have been, I don't know, something more ongoing?
Hard to say for sure, but Barker does bring up the possibility that, well, maybe there was a hereditary factor to his struggles. Wordsworth's mother died young, probably from consumption, but she also had what they called back then nervous disorders.
So maybe a genetic predisposition to anxiety or mood disorders, that could definitely explain some things.
It's a possibility, and something scholars debate about. We got to remember, mental illness wasn't really understood back then. What might have seemed eccentric or melancholy to them, well, we might see it totally differently today.
Yeah, our understanding of mental health is totally different now. It's tough to use our modern diagnoses on someone from so long ago.
Exactly. So we can't say for sure if Wordsworth had a specific diagnosis, but, it seems pretty clear he was going through some serious psychological distress throughout his life.
And that brings us back to the core of this podcast.
Yeah.
How do we square that potential distress with his undeniable brilliance as an artist? Did one feed the other? Were they totally separate?
The million-dollar question. And Barker, she gives us tons of information about his life, but doesn't really try to connect those dots for us. She does, though, offer this really interesting insight into how Wordsworth created his work.
Okay, I'm curious. Tell me about this creative process.
So Barker talks about how Wordsworth, he needed to be in a certain mood, a certain emotional state to write. He would actually try to make himself feel melancholy, even seek out experiences that would trigger those feelings.
Wow, so he was purposely stirring up those tough emotions, almost like using them as fuel for his writing.
Right. And it makes you think, was this a healthy way of dealing with those emotions, channeling them into his art? Or was it maybe making his mental health worse? It's a tough one to answer.
It's a question that goes beyond just Wordsworth.
Yeah.
Right? There's this idea that geniuses are tortured, that suffering is a necessary part of creating great art.
And it's a dangerous idea, too. It romanticizes mental illness, ignores how painful and difficult it can be. Mental illness can be devastating, even deadly. It's not something to be glorified or taken lightly.
But we also can't pretend there's no connection at all between, our minds, our emotions, and how we express ourselves creatively. Wordsworth's story shows us, I think, how complicated it really is.
For sure. It's not about glorifying suffering or saying all creative people are mentally ill. It's about understanding, having compassion, and realizing the human mind is just, complex. Wordsworth's life and his work, they push us to think about these questions in all their messiness.
So what's the bottom line here? What do we learn from diving into William Wordsworth?
I think the big takeaway is this. This mad genius idea, while it's interesting, it's way too simple. It's not about drawing a line between creativity and mental illness, but about understanding the full range of human experience, especially when it comes to these incredible minds.
Wordsworth shows us that You can be sensitive, intense, even struggle mentally and still be a creative genius, be resilient, and have deep love and connections in your life.
And maybe that's the most important thing. It's not about making suffering seem romantic or labeling creativity as something pathological. It's about approaching these topics with compassion, understanding, and a willingness to see how beautifully messy the human mind can be.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and work of William Wordsworth. If this gets you thinking, we want to hear from you. Join the conversation online, share your thoughts. Until next time, keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and keep embracing the complexity of being human.